While Lebanon's crisis is a result of years and years of corruption and mismanagement, the geopolitical risks didn't help us. It's very important to understand everything happening around us, the dynamics happening around us. That's why our guest for today is Greg Karlstrom. He is the Middle East correspondent for The Economist and author of the book, How Long Will Israel Survive? The Threat from Within. I'm going to go first to the first question, and we're going to talk about your famous book. In a nutshell, can you tell us how long do you think Israel will survive? And in your book, you clearly state that the demise of Israel will be due to the threat coming from within. Can you elaborate more on this point?
Well, I don't actually say in the book how long it's going to endure. It's a bit of a rhetorical flourish, the title. There's not a date. It doesn't end with, on December 13th, 2037. But it's a book about how, I think for most of Israel's history, it's been seen as a country that is beset by enemies from outside, the Arab-Israeli conflict, struggle with the Palestinians, and it's been seen as a country where its greatest threats are external ones. But it's also a country that has a lot of unresolved internal issues. They've had external threats or external enemies that have allowed them to paper over their internal differences and sort of create this internal unity. But those external threats are really dissipated at this point. This is a country that does not face external threats that are existential the way it might have in the earliest decades after its founding. And what you've seen particularly over the past 10 years with Benjamin Netanyahu as the prime minister until recently, is these internal issues really rising to the surface.
We saw the recent Israeli assault on Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah, and for the first time we saw an unprecedented support from the international community, from everyone from various backgrounds toward the Palestinian cause. Why do you think this time it was different?
I would say two things this time. One is particularly in America, where there's been a very unexpected shift in the tone in the media and public opinion in America, where it was much less pro-Israel. The other thing I would say is just simply also the role of social media in this. The fact that we saw this somewhat during 2014, during the last Gaza war, but we really saw it this time. The fact that every protest in Jerusalem, every Israeli incursion on the Temple Mount, the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, every bomb that was dropped in Gaza, all of this was sort of immediately on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, and it was much more accessible to people.
Iran and Saudi Arabia seem to be fighting over power in Syria, in Yemen, and in Iraq. In your opinion, who seems to have the upper hand to win?
I think purely as a geopolitical struggle, the Iranians have the upper hand. I think for decades, people have seen the region through the lens of this Saudi-Iranian Cold War or Saudi-Iranian proxy battle in the region. But I think the Iranians have won that battle at this point. You look at Syria, the effort to overthrow the Assad regime in Syria failed. You look at Yemen, where there's been this now 6-year war against the Houthis. You look at Iraq, it's been almost 20 years now since the US invasion, and Iran is unquestionably the strongest actor there. But it's been a Pyrrhic victory, because what have they gotten for that?
What is your take on the peace signing deal between Israel, UAE, and Bahrain? And what countries do you think will follow? And do you think these countries were they signed this peace deal as a sort of hedge against the rise of the two other powerful countries in the region, which are on one side Iran, on the other side Turkey?
I think it was definitely an attempt to hedge. If you look at the region now, you have this very weird situation where the three most influential countries, or most powerful countries, let's say, in the Middle East are non-Arab countries. I think what happened is, yes, the UAE in particular, hedging and throwing in its lot with the Israelis because they see Israel as a powerful state in the region and a state that is opposed to their enemies. I think the deals have turned out to be less than they were made out to be last year. We heard all of this happy talk last August about how these deals were going to be good for the Palestinians, they were going to be good for the peace process. A lot of that obviously hasn't come to pass. The deals have meant nothing for the Palestinians. You could say quite the opposite. They've been detrimental for the Palestinians.
And which countries do you think will follow next?
I think we're going to see a pause for a while on any countries signing agreements.
Do you think that KSA will follow? We are seeing nowadays a new standoff between UAE and KSA, who were the closest allies before. We saw a disagreement in the OPEC. We saw also Saudi decision to ban products import that originate in free zones and products that contain Israeli components. Do you think that this shows somewhere indirectly that KSA does not approve of these peace deals?
I think the Saudi attitude towards these deals, there remains a real generation gap where I think King Salman was not necessarily on board with these deals. Mohammed bin Salman, I think, feels very differently about them. The tariffs and these customs regulations that have gone into effect, I think that has less to do with the Israeli-Emirati agreement per se, and more to do with economic relations between Saudi and the UAE. I think the Saudis, as they're trying now to diversify their economy and create a private sector and move away from oil, the easiest way for them to do that, at least in the short term, is to try and steal things from the UAE. See if you can shift that production and those businesses to Saudi Arabia. So there was the announcement earlier this year that the Saudi government would stop contracting with companies unless they have a headquarters in Saudi Arabia. This customs announcement the other day, I see it in the same vein.
Reviving the nuclear deal is looking hard and faces many challenges. What are the main challenges today, and how long will it take to reach a deal? Will it be anytime soon?
When the Biden administration came in 6 months ago, I thought, and I think the consensus was, that they were very quickly going to move to re-enter the nuclear deal and go back to the way things were before Donald Trump. I'm not as convinced about that now, I think for a few reasons. One is the change of government in Tehran. We've seen the Iranians continue to accelerate their nuclear program over the past few months. There was a report the other day about production of uranium metal, which they're not meant to be able to do under the nuclear deal, but they've resumed doing. And so there's a growing sense, I think, in Washington and in other Western capitals that the Iranians have accumulated a lot of knowledge. They have advanced their nuclear program in a way that cannot be constrained by returning to the JCPOA.
Let's say the deal between the US and Iran is finalized today, or in the few weeks, or in a few months. What will happen to Hezbollah? Will his weapons still have a valid reason to exist?
I don't think anything will happen to their weapons as a result of a deal. I think we've heard Biden came in promising what he called the longer and stronger deal, a deal that would address not only the nuclear issues, but also Iran's ballistic missile program and its regional militias or regional partners. I think that was always a bit of a fantasy. The Iranians were willing to talk about their nuclear program because that was something they were willing to use as a bargaining chip. But when it comes to their broader foreign policy, to their support for, be it Hezbollah in Lebanon or militia groups in Iraq, they see that as a very central part of their foreign policy and their security doctrine. And it's not something they're willing to negotiate away.
Lebanon always used to rely on external power. And everyone believes in Lebanon that the solution never comes from within. And it's very linked to geopolitics. But no one is taking action today. They're all waiting for external power or their master in another country. Do you really think nothing can be done from within? And who are these masters who are controlling Lebanon?
No, I think something has to be done from within. I think even if, imagine in a few months' time, there is some kind of a political deal that is struck between the US and Iran, and let's say they address not only the nuclear file, but they manage to address the regional file as well, and the Saudis are on board with it, and everybody is content with this regional geopolitical deal. That is not going to unlock a flood of money that is going to come in and revive the Lebanese economy. If you don't have the internal reforms that the IMF and the World Bank and people here have been calling for years now, if you don't have those kinds of reforms, you're not going to have any progress on the socioeconomic issues here.
Do you think we might see any changes in the upcoming elections?
No, I don't think so. For a variety of reasons. You have, of course, this convoluted electoral law that is basically set up to favor the parties that are already in power and to make it hard for outsiders to come in. You have a situation now where 2 years ago, in October 2019, there was this wave of popular revulsion against the political class, right? And there was a sense that this political class had outlived its usefulness and served no purpose anymore. When you look at the situation today, though, 2 years later, where the economic and socioeconomic circumstances have become so bleak, it's almost given this political class a new lease on life, where however much it cost them to buy a vote in the last election, it's going to cost them far less now.
Today, it looks like no one has interest in forming the government. On one side, no one there is forming a government because they know that the international community is asking for reforms and they don't want to take the responsibility of these harsh actions that they have to make. On the second front, number two, Hezbollah seems to want to make it clear to the international community that any formation of government should go through him. So how do you see this deadlock unlocking?
I don't know how it unlocks. I mean, this is the problem right now, right? You're right. I think Hariri does not want to be responsible for the collapse and for the measures that have to be implemented. And he would be happy to walk away and let someone take responsibility for that.
So thank you, Greg, for this very insightful interview. And the summary is that we need to help ourselves before looking at others and trying to think that external forces will always end up helping us. And let's hope for the best in the coming elections. Even if you're not very optimistic, let's hope that expats will vote in massively and that we will be able to do some changes on the ground, because change takes time and it doesn't happen overnight, but we need to keep the momentum going.